The lights were blinding, the cameras rolling, the nation tuned in. And then, without warning, Kellyanne Conway erupted. Her voice rose like a storm, sharp and relentless, each word dripping with contempt. She jabbed her finger in the air, her face tightening with scorn, as if sheer volume and venom could bend truth itself to her will. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Even in a political world accustomed to shouting matches, this was something else. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she let the tirade unfold, every sneer and accusation echoing louder by the second. Conway's fury filled the studio, but Crockett's silence filled it even more. There was a power in restraint, a dignity that didn't need to match fire with fire. When Conway finally paused for breath, the air hung thick, like the moment before thunder cracks. And then it came. Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice calm, deliberate, piercing the chaos with a clarity that silenced the room. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth, spoken with the kind of conviction that cuts deeper than rage ever could. The audience gasped. The contrast was undeniable. Arrogance crashing against grace, and grace standing tall. The cameras caught everything. Flushed face, Crockett's steady eyes. The stunned expressions of those who realized they were witnessing something far bigger than a cable. Hughes spat. The clash was more than personal. It was symbolic. Two visions of America in collision, one built on bluster, the other on composure. And in that instant, millions watching could feel the weight of the moment. The narrator's voice cut through the silence. This wasn't just a clash, it was arrogance colliding with unshakable grace. But this was only the beginning. The real battle wasn't just about who could out-talk the other on live TV. It was about something deeper. Something that would shake the very idea of who gets to define truth in America. Because what happened next would turn a heated exchange into a defining political moment. Why did Kellyanne Conway's eruption matter so much? Because this wasn't just another pundit lashing out on television. Conway wasn't an ordinary guest. She had been Donald Trump's most trusted spokesperson. The so-called master of spin, a figure who built her career on twisting narratives, reshaping scandals, and bending reality until the truth itself seemed negotiable. For years, she had walked into studios like this one with unshakable confidence, armed with clever wordplay and deflection that left interviewers chasing their own tails. But on this night, something was different. The confrontation wasn't about a single insult or a cheap exchange of sound bites. It was about the moral and cultural core of America. Conway's rage wasn't just a personal attack. It was a weapon wielded in defense of a worldview that had dominated conservative politics for decades. That power could excuse hypocrisy. That anger could overshadow justice. That arrogance could masquerade as authority. JasmineCrockett's.com reply exposed the cracks in that worldview, and the people watching knew it. The air online lit up almost instantly. Within minutes, Twitter, now X, was buzzing with hashtags. Hashtag Conway Meltdown began trending, followed closely by hashtag Crockett.com, says side by side. Clips flooded feeds. Conway's finger-pointing fury contrasted with Crockett's unshaken poise. One viral tweet read, "Conway screams, Crockett teaches." That's the difference. Another captioned the moment simply, "Grace versus grift." The stakes grew beyond the studio. Commentators framed it not as a spat, but as a turning point in a larger struggle. This was about more than two women facing off under the studio lights. This was about the battle over truth itself. In America, who gets to define it? Who gets to distort it? And who has the courage to stand in it? For Conway, the risks were immense. Every second of her meltdown chipped away at her carefully constructed image as a polished strategist, instead of controlling the narrative she had become. The narrative. And for Crockett, the reward was clear. The more composed she remained, the more she embodied the strength, dignity, and justice that millions of Americans longed to see reflected in their leaders. The narrator's voice framed it with stark simplicity. This isn't just two women arguing, it's about the battle over truth itself. And that battle was tilting. For years, Conway had commanded the stage, dictating the tempo of conversations. But on this night, her fury backfired. Because in the theater of politics, perception is everything. And perception was slipping through her fingers. And just when Conway thought she held control, the narrative slipped away. To understand why Kellyanne Conway's meltdown carried such weight, you have to understand who she was in the political theater of America. For years, she stood as the archetypal villainot, with brute force or thunderous speeches, but with words sharpened into weapons. Conway was the spin doctor, the gaslighter, the master of diversion, who could take any question and twist it until the truth itself seemed irrelevant. Flashback after flashback paints the picture. There was the infamous alternative facts moment when she looked into the camera and declared that lies could be rebranded into something palatable, something sellable. It wasn't just a phrase, it became a symbol of an entire era of political distortion. Then came the interviews where she would dodge, pivot, and weave, leaving anchors speechless. Not because she won the argument, but because she had buried it under layers of distraction. She had perfected the art of contradiction. One day she would preach about family values. The next, she would defend policies tearing families apart at the border. She could invoke faith with a solemn tone while simultaneously defending cruelty dressed up as governance. The arrogance wasn't subtle. It was her calling card. She thrived on it, knowing that in the chaotic world of cable news, dominance wasn't about truth, it was about control. And Conway knew how to seize control better than almost anyone. Over the years, this reputation hardened into myth. Journalists prepared themselves before interviewing her like gladiators entering an arena. Opponents braced for the hurricane of half-truths and rhetorical traps. She carried herself with the air of someone untouchable, convinced that her ability to twist words meant she could twist reality itself. But beneath the surface, there was always a cost. Audiences grew weary. Clips of her contradictions circulated online, turning into memes that mocked rather than praised. For every moment she spun the narrative, another clip went viral, exposing just how far she would go to defend the indefensible. Her power was undeniable, but it was laced with arrogance, the kind that blinded her to shifting tides. This is what made her eruption against Jasmine Crockett so telling. Conway walked into the studio convinced she could play her usual game: intimidate, dominate, spin until the conversation bent in her direction. But what she failed to see was that the cultural moment had changed. People weren't looking for clever spin anymore. They were craving authenticity, dignity, and truth. And Crockett embodied all three. The narrator's voice cuts in, heavy with foreshadowing, for years. Conway had dominated the media battlefield until she met an opponent who refused to play her game. To truly understand the power of Jasmine Crockett's calm/steady voice in that studio, Cooney, we need to go back to where it all began, not with the cameras, not with the bright lights of Washington, but with the roots that shaped her into the leader she became. Crockett's story is one of resilience. Raised in a home where faith was not a performance, but a practice, she learned early on that service was not optional, it was a duty. Her parents, grounded in both faith and hard work, instilled in her the belief that dignity was not something you demanded from others, but something you carried in yourself, even when the world tried to strip it away. The Bible wasn't a tool for political theater in her family. It was a source of strength, a guide for living, a promise that justice had meaning. As a young girl, Crockett wasn't content to sit quietly when injustice appeared. Teachers remember her speaking up when classmates were treated unfairly. Neighbors recall how she volunteered to help organize food drives, clothing donations, and neighborhood safety programs. For her, community wasn't just where you lived, it was who you were responsible for. That sense of duty led her to law. In courtrooms and legal clinics, she became known not for theatrics, but for preparation, precision, and unwavering composure. As a civil rights attorney, she fought for people who didn't have the means to fight for themselves. Families threatened with eviction, workers cheated out of fair pay, citizens silenced by systemic neglect. Crockett stood by them with a quiet fierceness that carried more weight than the loudest shouting ever could. Her reputation grew not because she sought attention, but because she refused to back down. Even when the odds were stacked against her, it was only a matter of time before her journey from local advocacy carried her to the political stage. She didn't run on empty slogans or slick marketing campaigns. She ran on credibility, on a record of standing with people who had been ignored for too long. And the voters saw something rare in her authenticity. She wasn't performing. She was living the values she spoke about. That authenticity became her defining trait. In an age when politics seemed consumed by spin, Crockett remained unshaken. Interviewers tried to bait her into fiery sound bites, but she responded with calm clarity. Opponents hurled insults, yet she met them with facts, framed in a language that made people feel seen. The more they tried to rattle her, the stronger her dignity appeared. Her composure wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Crockett understood something her opponents didn't. In a world addicted to outrage, grace was its own form of resistance. And every time she held her ground, every time she answered contempt with clarity, the contrast made her stronger. This was why Kellyanne Conway, the master of spin, met her match in Jasmine Crockett. Conway's power came from disorienting her. Opponents, pulling them into a whirlwind of contradictions until they lost their footing. But Crockett could not be pulled off balance. Her life had trained her for this moment. She had walked into courtrooms stacked against her, stood in communities overlooked by power, and faced down systemic injustice. A loud voice, a finger pointing. Tirade, none of it was enough to shake her. The narrator's voice sharpens. This wasn't just a woman with facts. It was a leader whose life embodied justice. And that is what made the stage set for their clash so electric. Conway came in armed with arrogance, spin, and the belief that her usual tricks would hold. Crockett carried something heavier, something harder to break. She carried authenticity, forged in faith, service, and struggle. The cliffhanger arrives. Tension thickening, and when Conway's attacks came, Crockett was more than ready. The studio lights burned hotter as Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. Her words cut like serrated edges, designed not to persuade but to humiliate. She mocked Jasmine Crockett's values, her career, even her very right to speak on matters of faith and politics. With every barb, Conway's tone grew sharper, her volume louder, less a debate than a scolding. As though she were trying to reduce her opponent into silence, through sheer force of arrogance. But silence never came. Crockett sat with a posture so calm it almost seemed rehearsed, though it wasn't. Her stillness was not passivity, it was power. She waited for Conway to finish each tirade, never interrupting, never flinching. And when the final venom-laced sentence dropped, Crockett would lean in ever so slightly, pause, letting the silence hang heavy, and then deliver her response. With surgical precision, her words didn't match Conway's volume, but they outmatched her entirely in weight. Reply was sharp, deliberate, and rooted in clarity. Where Conway's sentences tangled in contradictions, Crockett sliced, clean through. And the more Crockett spoke, the more the imbalance revealed itself. The audience felt it first. A murmur spread through the studio, whispers trading like sparks. Viewers shifted in their seats, leaning forward. The tension wasn't just in what was being said, it was in what wasn't. The cameras zoomed tighter, capturing the contrast in real time. Conway's reddening face, her tightened jaw, the way her words began to stumble as her opponent's poise remained unbroken. Every time Conway raised her volume, Crockett countered with calm. Every insult hurled was met with a reply that did not defend but dismantled. It wasn't just a debate, it was a mirror being held up, reflecting the emptiness of bluster against the strength of conviction. Conway's frustration began to show. Her rhythm broke. Her cadence lost its practiced polish. She reached for interruptions, for snide asides, for the quick jab that usually threw opponents off balance, but Crockett didn't take the bait. She simply paused, waited for the noise to die down, and answered as though the interruption itself had only proved her point. More Crockett stayed composed, the more Conway unraveled, and the crowd, sensing the imbalance, began to respond. A gasp here, a ripple of laughter there. At one point, when Conway fumbled over her own words mid-rant, A hush swept through the room, half shock, half anticipation. The narrator's voice. Cut in, tense, and hushed. The room knew it was about to explode. Crockett, her gaze unwavering, prepared her next line. The studio braced itself, the audience on edge, as if aware that something seismic was about to happen. And then, the narrator promises, Crockett delivered the line that no one saw coming. The room was thick with tension, every eye locked on the table where Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, still trying to dominate with volume. But Jasmine Crockett did not mirror her. Instead, she sat back, hands folded, gaze steady, waiting. The silence that followed Conway's latest rant stretched like a taut wire. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Then Crockett spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, so measured that each word landed heavier than Conway's entire storm of shouting. She began not with attack, but with clarity. Miss Conway, she said softly, you've spent years perfecting the art of twisting words. But what you can't twist are facts, and what you certainly can't twist is truth. The crowd shifted. That first blow wasn't loud, but it was surgical. Point by point, Crockett began dismantling Conway's barrage. When Conway had sneered about Crockett's morals, Crockett countered with her record of community service, her fight for marginalized voices, her unbroken ties to the people she served. When Conway had mocked her faith, Crockett responded with verses rooted in justice and compassion, words Conway had once cherry-picked for power, but never lived by. Each rebuttal was crisp, timed with devastating pauses. Crockett knew the rhythm of the room. She allowed silence to hang just long enough for her words to sink in. Each pause grew heavier, and each reply sharper, until it was clear the tide had shifted. The cameras zoomed in on Conway. The once polished master of spin was cracking. Her face flushed deeper, her smirk faltered, and her hands fidgeted with the microphone. She tried to interject to cut Crockett off, but every attempt sounded more desperate, more hollow. Crockett's composure only magnified the contrast. Claimed to speak for morality, she continued, her voice steady. But morality is not about sound bites. It's about how we treat the least among us. It's about dignity. And if you think shouting me down changes that truth, you're mistaken. The words landed like hammer strikes. Gasps fluttered across the studio. Some audience members clapped involuntarily before quickly stopping themselves. The tension had shifted. It was no longer Conway controlling the stage. It was Crockett. And then came the line. The line that would turn the entire confrontation upside down. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes unflinching. Kellyanne, you've made a career preaching about truth while defending lies. But tonight, the difference between us is simple. You perform your morality. I live mine. The studio detonated. Applause thundered through the room, gasps giving way to cheers. The crowd rose to its feet, some clapping, others shouting. The noise drowning out Conway's stunned attempt at a comeback. Cameras caught Conway fumbling for words, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her authority dissolving. In real time, for the first time in years, the woman who had built an empire on deflection stood exposed, her tricks useless against Crockett's unshakable clarity. The narrator's voice cut in, low and charged with finality. It wasn't just a reply, it was the end of Conway's control. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, arrogance unraveling into desperation. On the other, dignity standing tall, unshaken, commanding the moment. Social media producers in the control room scrambled, knowing instinctively this was the clip that would go viral before the broadcast even ended. Viewers at home rushed too. Grabbed phones, already typing hashtags that would dominate timelines. The sound of the crowd's roar carried like electricity through the air. But beyond the studio, something larger stirred. This wasn't merely about one debate or one clash between two women. It was about the collision of two Americas, one clinging to spin and spectacle, the other grounded in truth and justice. And as the crowd's cheers echoed, the narrator's voice sharpened, promising more. But the shockwaves didn't stop. There they rippled across the entire nation. The clip didn't just air, it detonated. Within minutes of Conway's stunned silence and Crockett's piercing line, The moment spread like wildfire across social media. Twitter, or X, as some now called it, was a battlefield of hashtags. Hashtag Conway Meltdown, hashtag Crockett.com, and hashtag Truth Over Spin trended nationally before the segment had even finished airing. Clips of Crockett's mic drop reply were looped endlessly, shared millions of times. One meme froze Conway mid-stammer, captioned, "When your spin stops spinning." Another contrasted Crockett's serene face with Conway's flustered glare under the words, "Grace versus noise." TikTok creators stitched the video into dances, skits, and dramatic voiceovers. On Instagram, reels of the exchange racked up views in the tens of millions. Late-night comedy shows pounced instantly. One host quipped, "Conway tried to gaslight, but Crockett brought the fire extinguisher." Another joked, "Kellyanne Conway hasn't been that speechless since, well, ever." Laughter rippled across living rooms nationwide, but beneath the humor, something deeper was taking hold. Cable news seized on it too. CNN framed it as a pivotal culture clash. Crockett shows the power of dignity under fire. Her as a rising voice of clarity in an age of chaos. Even Fox News, struggling to defend Conway, resorted to framing her as outnumbered. But the clips themselves betrayed the truth.